Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. Hello everyone and welcome to another podcast interview for the Idea to Value podcast. I'm very happy to have Tony Ulwick with me today. He's the CEO of innovation consulting firm Strategyn and author of the books Jobs to be Done and What Customers Want. Tony, it's wonderful having you with us.
Nick, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So Tony, why don't you tell us about the sort of work you do at Strategyn and how you got into the field of innovation?
Well, it's a long history, but I had started back in my IBM days. I experienced a failure on a product called the PC Junior, and it was motivating, to say the least. What happened is that we introduced the IBM's version of the personal computer to the home market. And this was back in 1984. And while the product was supposed to just take over the world, it turned out to be a huge flop. In fact, the day after it was introduced in the Wall Street Journal, the headlines read, "The PC Junior is a flop." And gosh, it was. It took us a year to admit it to ourselves. But I thought afterwards, how did they know that so quickly, right? What metrics were they using to figure out that the product was not going to win in the marketplace? And if only we knew what those metrics were well in advance, we could have just created the product around those metrics and had a successful result. So that got me thinking about innovation as a process. So I spent my last 5 years at IBM trying to think through a better way to innovate. And it finally occurred to me back in around the 1990 timeframe. You've probably heard the quote from Levitt, people don't want the quarter-inch drill, they want the quarter-inch hole. I finally realized that gave us a different path to think about innovation. So instead of going to customers and asking them about creating a better drill, let's just go talk to customers about the underlying process they're trying to execute and break down that process like you'd break down, a manufacturing process or a business process. You break it down step by step. And at that time, Six Sigma was starting to take hold, and I was familiar with that. I actually have a background in mechanical and manufacturing engineering. And thinking about this from a process standpoint, I thought this would be great. If we could study that underlying process people are trying to execute, we could break it down into steps and figure out how they can measure success. And that gave way, that thought gave way to an innovation process that we now call outcome-driven innovation. And I started Strategyn in '91. We've been at it ever since. Most of my clients are Fortune 500 companies, and still very active in the business, running as CEO and participate daily in projects with some of the best companies in the world.
And I think this example from IBM is fascinating because everyone remembers IBM from the 90s as being the king of personal computers, and personal computers were for a long time called IBM clones. But you're saying that the first attempt at it didn't work out as people expected.
Well, that was their home computer. That didn't work out. Their business computers did pretty well, but even their business computers started waning. They introduced another concept called microchannel architecture, and this was on their PC, on their business PCs, which basically made them incompatible with IBM clones. Mm-hmm. The IBM clones went off to keep the market intact, and IBM's market share, even in the PC business, went from, at one point, 85% down to 10% by the early 1990s. There's just a remarkable decline.
So I want to touch on one of the things you mentioned just there, which is this disconnect between what IBM thought was going to be successful and the near instantaneous reaction from the market. Now, as we all know, the market can sometimes be wildly wrong. I remember back when the first reviews of the iPad came out and people said, we don't know what this is for. Is it gonna become just another flop for Apple? And it turns out that it was one of their biggest hits. But what do you think caused this disconnect between what was going on behind the scenes at IBM when this product was being developed and the reason it didn't click with the customers at the end?
Well, I think it's the same problem that companies have every day. And, this is interesting, but, I think about innovation as a process where we're trying to come up with solutions that address unmet needs. It sounds like that should be pretty simple. There's only two inputs into the equation. And what I find is that companies really don't have much trouble coming up with ideas. But the problem with all this, and I think the problem with IBM as well, is that there was no agreement on what a customer need actually is. And the team putting together the IBM PC Junior certainly didn't agree on what the customer's needs were or which needs were unmet. We had none of that insight. And I think that's the problem with many companies and in many situations. While the entire team, of course, is well motivated, everyone's intent on creating solutions that address unmet needs, people come at it from different angles. So there's typically nobody on the team that knows all the customer's needs and which are unmet. And the dynamics, of course, would change dramatically if everybody knew what all the needs were and which are unmet. Right? And so that's really been the focus of our approach, is to enable companies to come up with a common language around which to define a need and reach that agreement. And the thought is, if we can all agree on what the needs are and which are unmet, and if there's segments of customers with different unmet needs, then creating the solution for them is going to be much, much simpler. And that has proven to be the case.
And this is where the concept of the jobs to be done theory of innovation really comes into play. Now, you originally referred to it as something different. Was it something like outcome-driven innovation? Was that right?
Yeah, that's right. So outcome-driven innovation is the name we have given our process since like the mid-90s or so. Yeah.
And it's really gained a lot of traction over the last year from Professor Clayton Christensen's new book, Competing Against Luck. And I was fortunate enough to interview the two other co-writers, Teddy Hall and Karen Dillon, during my recent Innovation and Creativity Summit. And Jobs to be Done, it really resonates with a lot of people in the innovation field. Why do you think that is from your experience?
Well, I think it adds a level of simplification and understanding of something that is seemingly very complex. And from my view, I've always thought of innovation as this equation, if you will, where we have, we're trying to come up with solutions that address unmet needs. And like any good equation, you need some constants in the equation so you can solve it. And when you think about innovation, most people would say that solutions clearly are variables, and they'd probably argue that needs are also variables. They're ever changing. You can't discover them. And that's what really posed the challenge, is to figure out, is there a way to make needs a constant in the equation? And that's where Jobs to be Done comes in handy, because if you define all your needs around the job the customer's trying to get done, well, now you have a stable environment, because the job is stable over time. And if you can create that set of constants, you can then test solutions against those metrics, if you will, and figure out what solutions will win in the future. And that's what outcome-driven innovation is all about. I personally introduced outcome-driven innovation to Clay Christensen back in 1999 after reading this book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which I thought was remarkable, and thought that ODI really had the potential of solving the innovator's dilemma. And Clay was kind enough to have me in his office, and we talked about that and spent a bit of time together over the coming years. And in his book, The Innovator's Solution, he introduced that concept of people buy products to get a job done. And it really took off. And to your point, I think it resonates with people because we're always trying to get jobs done. This is what we spend our days doing. So yeah, I think it resonates with people at a more intuitive level.
And for people who aren't as aware of what the Jobs to be Done theory is, could you give us a quick introduction as to the theory and how it's actually used in a business innovation context?
Sure. So the theory is fairly straightforward. People buy products and services to execute some job or to execute some underlying process. And by focusing on that underlying process, we now have a stable focal point around which we can create customer value and a new avenue for understanding customer needs. So that's the theory, right? Now putting it in practice then, of course, is what outcome-driven innovation is all about, where we execute on that concept. We take a market and we break it down first to figure out who the job executor is and what is the job they're trying to get done. Is it parents that are trying to pass on life lessons to children? Is it tradesmen that are trying to cut a piece of wood in a straight line? And once we discover what the market is, and notice we define that a bit differently, as a group of people in a job, we can then create what we call a job map. And we published an article in HBR back in 2008 that introduces the job map concept. That lays out a framework around which we can understand the market. A couple of interesting things come from that. The job map points out where products will evolve to in the future. What we've learned is that most products just get part of a job done, and that people are forced to cobble together lots of different solutions to get the entire job done. And a stable strategy and a long-term vision for a company that will always work is straightforward and simple. That is, work to create a solution that gets the entire job done on a single platform, because that's where the market's going to go. So what we help our clients do is to figure out what that job is, and then uncover all the metrics that people use to measure success and value in getting that job done, and use those inputs, which are often 100 inputs or more, to figure out where the customer's struggling to get the job done. Then we use those metrics to guide the creation of new products.
And I think this is where a lot of people would really love your input. It's this question about finding out exactly what the jobs to be done are, because I think a lot of people, they hear about design thinking, they hear about jobs to be done, but they don't necessarily know about how you actually go and find out from individuals what sort of things they're struggling with and what jobs they want done.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point, and there's a couple of distinctions there. Jobs to be done can be used to discover new markets to go after, and it can also be used to improve the products and services you have in an existing market. So they're two different things. From a market discovery standpoint, you can go out and scour the world to figure out, are there groups of people with different jobs that they're struggling with? So we've done this exercise, with parents, for example. What are all the jobs that parents are trying to get done? And as you might guess, there's lots of them, right? Mm-hmm. And you talk to parents and figure out all the things they're trying to accomplish, but you want to figure out which ones are most underserved, like which one really represents a great opportunity for value creation. And one of them that we came up with is parents trying to pass on life lessons to children. Now, when you think about that, that's clearly a job. There's lots of parents who try to do that. It's a job they want to execute frequently, and it's also a job for which there's very few formal products for. Sure, you could try to correct kids when they do things improperly, or you could give them books to read, but there's really no tool or mechanism to allow that to happen in a very effective way. So even though there are really no products in that market, it's still a market, right? From a product standpoint, you'd say it doesn't exist. But from a group of people and a job to be done standpoint, the market is huge. It holds huge potential if you could figure out how to solve it. So that's part of it. That's market discovery. But then there's lots of our clients who just want to improve their existing products and create new products in their space. So with Bosch, for example, we helped them in the circular saw market. They wanted to enter the market, North American market, with a high-end circular saw that would get the job done better at the same price point as DeWalt and Makita. So in that case, the products already exist. They're trying to create a circular saw. So we discover, we look at tradesmen who are trying to cut a piece of wood in a straight line. We break that down into its process steps. We figure out all the metrics people are using to measure success along the way and figure out where the opportunities are. And in that case, when we looked at the average market, there were no opportunities. In other words, when we interviewed, we quantified all those needs with 270 tradesmen. On average, there were no unmet needs. And this led us down the path of segmenting around unmet needs. And this is something that's a very important part of our process because it's very rare that people agree on what needs are unmet. And in that market, we discovered a group of people that were more underserved than everybody else. And it was because they had to make more finish cuts and lengthy cuts. They had to make more angle cuts. And as a result, they had to make more blade height adjustments and blade angle adjustments. And they had 14 unmet needs that nobody else had. And that became the focal point around which the Bosch team innovated. And when we presented them with the findings and showed them that that segment existed and here's the 14 unmet needs, it took them just 3 hours to conceptualize the CS20 circular saw, which became their best-selling circular saw for about 10 years in that space. And that kind of gives you some insight into the power of the approach. You know, if we understand the job at a really granular level, then we can discover what needs are and which are unmet, and segments of customers with different unmet needs. It can guide our market and product strategy and make it very effective and make it far more predictable and profitable.
I love the fact that you talked about this concept of the average customer and them not being able to agree on their needs, because a lot of companies, and I see this a lot in startups, they have this idealized idea of what their customer is or who their customer is. And quite often you'll see them putting together avatars of their ideal customer. And they'll say, our ideal customer is called Jake, and he's 23 years old, and he likes American Apparel clothes, and he works in a tech startup, and they've got this list of characteristics of this avatar without them actually ever having met an individual who meets these needs. And what I'm getting the sense of here is if you want to find out people's jobs to be done, you can't guess about who these fictional people are and what their needs are. You actually need to go out there and meet real people and find out their views on what they need. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I get a kick out of that approach. I mean, I can see what people are trying to do. They're trying to come up with a segment of people that have a unique set of unmet needs, but they're doing it without having a clear understanding of what a need is, what the needs are, and which are unmet, and are there segments of people with different unmet needs. So they're shortcutting the entire process and making an assumption or creating a hypothesis that that group of people exists. So, you know, what are the chances that someone randomly develops this avatar or persona that describes perfectly, you know, exactly what segment is underserved and exactly what unmet needs exist? It's next to zero. You know, trying to do this without quantitative data is guesswork.
Absolutely.
So we like to mitigate the risk of failure with our clients, and they don't believe in guesswork, so and we don't either. So using those types of techniques, we think, can certainly mislead a company to focus on a phantom target or phantom segment.
And that's an interesting thing to touch on as well, because you've been talking about finding metrics of needs and metrics of potential success. But if you take the process of going out and meeting individual people and finding out what their needs are, individual people are by their very nature a very, very small data set. So how do you approach finding out whether or not there is a market for people who have a specific need? Do you see what I'm getting at?
I think so. So we break our approach into two steps, the qualitative phase and the quantitative phase. And in the qualitative phase, the goal is to discover what all those metrics are. You know, so if we're talking to tradesmen who are trying to cut a piece of wood in a straight line, we'll go talk to electricians and plumbers and finished carpenters and roofers and framers and ask them about this job and capture this set of needs. So through maybe 10 to 20 interviews, we can capture a complete set of needs. But then we have to figure out which are unmet. So we're not going to rely on 20 people to tell us which needs are unmet. We're not going to guess at that ourselves. What we'll do is we'll put those statements, those 100 or so statements, in a survey and put that survey out to maybe 600 people and have them rate them for importance and satisfaction, where they're telling us which of those metrics are really important to them but not well satisfied with the products that exist today. And it's that quantitative data set that allows us to build a quantitative data model that we use to predict which products will win or lose in the marketplace.
Tony, it's been fascinating speaking with you. I wish we had more time, but we're coming up to the end of the interview. Before we go, though, could you tell us a bit more about your newest book?
Sure. So that came out last October. It's called Jobs to Be Done, Theory to Practice. It's a follow-up to the original book I put out on Jobs to Be Done back in 2005 called What Customers Want. But in the latest book, it introduces some new thinking. It explains how the process has evolved, some of the nuances, how we define needs in 5 different categories, and some of the advancements we've made with segmentation, willingness to pay, competitive analysis, and other parts of the process. So it's really an evolution of the approach that's described in that book.
And if people want to find out more about you and the work that your company does, where can they go?
Well, they can certainly go to Strategyn.com. And they can find those books I mentioned at Amazon.
Perfect. Tony, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Nick, it'd be my pleasure. Thank you.
Today's episode was made possible by members of our premium Deep Creativity Training program. For less than the price of half a candy bar per day, you too can get world-exclusive daily exercises which push your creativity past its comfort barrier to make you better able to generate ideas in all aspects of your life and work. Invest in yourself now by going to www.ideatovalue.com/deepcreativity and using coupon code PODCAST for 25% off your first order. And don't forget that if you found this episode interesting, to like and share it, and to leave us a review in your favorite podcast player. See you again in the next episode.